Last night I again slept really well. I was getting really tired around 8:30, and so I was just laying down in bed listening to an audio, and I was falling asleep, and I had to actually consciously get up and take my meds before I fell asleep without taking them. And that never happened, so it feels like I'm just getting naturally tired and then just naturally going to sleep. So these last 2 nights, I just feel like a regular sleeper. And the last 2 days, I feel more calm and I just feel more normal, I guess. It's a slight difference, but it's also significant. I don't feel that much different, but there's some kind of qualitative change that makes me feel really different at the same time. I feel like it's getting easier and not harder. And I was looking at my notebook and I wrote down, I didn't like the non-locality of last night. I need to sleep. And I think that was referring to when I would close my eyes and feel like I was remote viewing and I'd rather be sleeping. But perhaps part of it is getting used to non-locality in some way and non-linearity. And I wonder if as the universe becomes brighter in one's reality, the me disappears or loses its strength, just like when one is in a really well-lit city, it's hard to see the stars. So when the universe is well-lit within ourselves, it's hard to see that ego me. So can the universe be brighter than the me? Or can we expand what we consider to be ourself? Because it's just a model, and we can model something else. In MAPP Consciousness, it's proprioception of something else, not just of the self that we have, that we don't usually even propriocept, we just take it to be reality. But when we start to propriocept the me in MAPP Consciousness, then we can start to see what it's doing and the poisonous nature of its systemic structure. And then we can start to allow that to dissolve and start to expand into including others and nature. So there's increased self-perception in that more things are sensed as self. Perhaps everything in the heart field. Yet at the same time, this decreases the felt sense of self as separate from other. And the body has proprioception. It can tell what it's doing without thinking, and that's how we're able to move. So is there a Gaia proprioception? Can we feel what the whole body of the earth is doing without thinking? Can we just know? Can we just sense that movement? Is there a proprioception of that doesn't require so much thought? And maybe when we first go into MAPP Consciousness, there's thoughts related to what is happening out there in Gaia. But when we integrate that, we don't necessarily need thoughts to know that anymore. We don't need to have a thought about every single thing we see happening in Gaia to really know what's happening. The thoughts start to turn into an embodiment of nature and a felt sense of that without having to think about it. Just like we don't have to think about the movement of our body, we don't necessarily have to think about the movement of Gaia, which is part of our body. And in MAPP Consciousness, we start to expand into that. And MAPP Consciousness reveals a lot of things. They come into awareness, and some of them are disturbing. And there could be a misstep in trying to modify that instead of just being with it and seeing it, seeing what that which arises is doing, but not trying to do something about it, because that's within the same field as that mechanism that we're seeing what it's doing. when we just watch the mechanism and allow the whole thing to unfold, when we have the wholeness of the perception of that, that will be what is required to actually transform that mechanism. So part of being in MAPP consciousness could even be allowing the whole thing to unfold, the whole it, and not trying to do anything about it within that same sphere of doing. And then that's what allows for the transformation. And that's part of why I've talked about how maybe this process needs to complete. And can we put our thoughts into words to see how they work? And in a way, when we're in the state of MAPP consciousness, we're perceiving things way beyond we normally perceive. And in a way, it's a movement, and we're not really sure what to make of all that movement that we've never perceived. So I feel like when we're perceiving it, it gets translated into words in an attempt to allow us to understand what we're seeing. But those words are way off what we're normally used to in terms of ideas and thoughts, and they don't feel like me because we're perceiving out something outside of ourselves, the whole process of Gaia, but it's being translated into thought. And some of it's ecstatic and some of it's scary, mainly because it's outside of what we are used to perceiving. So we're perceiving something, and that's translated into thought a lot of times because we're seeing beyond, and we only speak the language of thought. So Gaia translates that into thought and sort of transmits it to our brain, and we think, who's thinking this, or what the heck is going on? But it's just our perception being translated into the dominant mode of how our brain operates. And then eventually the thoughts can subside when we're more used to just perceiving and allowing that perception to move the brain without the brain also moving in thought. And I'm back to a little bit of David Bohm's conversation with Nichols, and he probably said that thing about put thoughts into words to see how things work. So usually to see how things work, we kind of need to put it into words. So Gaia can do that for us too, if she's trying to show us how she works. Just like if a mechanic was to observe some kind of mechanical process, they would look at, say, a bike wheel spinning, and then they might be able to put into words how that's happening. So if we go out in this expanded sensitivity in MAPP consciousness, and we look at, say, a tree falling over, we might be informed by Gaia that it's because of the drought, because of the change in weather, because of this, because of that. So it's just seeing the whole process of life and putting that into words, and it can be pretty intense. It's like being a mechanic of Gaia and understanding how things work just by looking at it, because Gaia speaks to us just like a mechanic might have a mechanical process speak to them, or they speak about what they see is happening because they have that training. Well, I feel like Gaia is trying to give us the training of seeing how she works so we can be stewards of her. If we don't know that language, we're separate from it. We're not paying attention to Gaia. And then we feel ourselves as completely separate. But when we're looking at Gaia and speaking that language, we can't feel separate because we're part of it. So really, MAPP consciousness could be even training in some kind of stewardship of Gaia, because we start to understand how she works and what she needs and what we're doing that isn't good. And not just by doing some scientific experiments, but just by looking. And when we understand, we can just look and speak about it instead of having to do 10 years of science on one tiny variable. Just like a mechanic, once they understand the mechanical processes and the laws and things, they can just talk about it. They don't have to do an experiment about the laws of physics every time they observe a wheel turning. And David Bohm also said, words being used to make processes visible just to observe, not to change something. So in this analogy of speaking Gaia, when we're observing all these things, we can't necessarily do that much to change it. So we can't necessarily change the weather. We could do things different in our actions to not contribute to climate change or bad weather, however that works. And all of that, of course, is debatable in science. But when one knows by speaking Gaia, one can change one's actions. Not to try to change to fix Gaia, but to change one's actions in relationship to Gaia. And then that naturally brings things more into harmony once one understands what's happening. And so we start to have a relationship with nature, so then we wouldn't harm nature. And that's kind of the point of learning to speak Gaia and learning to see these things. And David Bohm also said, see what the word is doing. It's also part of a nonverbal process. For example, nervous process, sound, etc. And we want to see what the meaning does, not what the meaning is. And I relate that to self-dialogue because, and also related to this whole idea of mental illness, because I've decided to make a lot of different meanings about it. And by doing a lot of different meanings, that means there's no one meaning, at least in my subjective experience. And so there is no meaning, because there can be any meaning. So ultimately there is no meaning. Yet I've said, oh, it's a meaning-making process. The meaning of life is life itself. So there's no meaning apart from that. But with words we can make meaning. So see what the words are doing. Words are making meaning of something that is just innately meaningful in itself without any word. We don't need words to make life meaningful, especially from the perspective of every other creature on this planet that doesn't have words. So look what the meaning does. And in life we have certain meanings. In society of goals and progress and etc., etc. And look what that meaning does. We think that's what the meaning is of life and being a human in society. But look at what that's doing. And I think that's actually part of what we get in contact with in MAPP Consciousness, is seeing what our meanings are doing. And all along we thought, well, these are what the meanings of life are. And then all of a sudden we get into MAPP Consciousness and see what those meanings that we just took to be what is are doing. And then that can be a really painful and scary process to attempt to decouple, and not even consciously or intentionally, but this energy comes in and attempts to decouple us from all that our neurology is programmed to see as meaningful. And so it's very scary. It's almost like this energy is trying to create us as some kind of outcast of society. But I don't know how many of us have gotten to the point where we see that we can be outside society but still relate to society and bring this other element that can be some of the gifts of transforming through this process. And is there a use of words for demechanization? Demechanization and being closer to life, to the energy of life itself. And one way to do that is be in nature, because that is life, and it's life itself. And I wrote down, how does insight work? Insight can look or talk about the insight process. Insight as a processor. Perhaps it's a feedback loop. Perhaps there is an insight feedback loop. So as one has an insight, one is able to see more and more. An insight is a whole. So each insight adds to the whole. It's a sum of wholes. Do one thing in nature, one all of a sudden can understand a lot of different things in nature. And I wonder if one day our brains will just naturally be in the state of insight and move from insight to insight instead of thought to thought. And then insight won't necessarily talk about insight. Just like fish don't likely think about water. And David Bohm says, thought has a beyond, a ground in reality. Thought must acknowledge that there is that beyond what can be grasped within thought. The whole of consciousness as we know it suspends itself to see a kind of consciousness we didn't know. And it's giving up nothing because we're giving up an illusion. And then they say we can't give up an illusion. How can you give up nothing? And I wrote, give up nothing and everything is. And David Bohm said, the realization that there is nothing to give up is crucial. And David Bohm says, then at some stage, thought may say that the right attitude is to suspend itself, to allow the brain, the nervous system, and the mind to move perhaps with the energy of the unlimited, or perhaps to enter into the unlimited. And to me, that sounds like MAPP consciousness. That's what happens in MAPP consciousness, though nobody there decides to do that. There's an energy that does that. And he said, we need to have enough confidence to let go, for thought to suspend itself. And I think part of what MAPP consciousness is doing, or trying to do, is give us the confidence to let go.